Hi, my name is Grandma Betty, and this is Grandma Betty's Recipes. Somewhere between the 1950s and the 1980s, America got comfortable, refrigerators got bigger, grocery stores got fancier, and suddenly nobody wanted to admit they'd ever eaten bread soaked in bacon grease for dinner and called it a blessing.
I grew up in a kitchen where nothing got wasted. Not a heel of bread, not a spoonful of bacon grease, not a single leftover potato. Every scrap meant something. These 20 meals didn't disappear because they were bad. They disappeared because America decided that needing to stretch a meal was something to be ashamed of. Well, I'm not ashamed. And by the time this video is over, I don't think you will be either. 1. Bread and drippings toast. Bread and drippings toast was exactly what it sounds like. Whatever bread you had, day old, slightly stale, didn't matter, spread with drippings collected from whatever meat you'd cooked that week. Bacon drippings, pork roast drippings, chicken fat, whatever had solidified in that little crock sitting beside your grandmother's stove.
You toasted the bread, sometimes directly on the stovetop burner, and while it was still hot, you'd spread those drippings on thick so they melted right into the surface. A pinch of salt on top. That was breakfast. Sometimes that was supper.
And now I know what you're thinking. Betty, that sounds like something you'd feed a farm animal. But that rendered pork fat had a smoky, savory richness that modern butter simply cannot touch. The moment families could afford to throw drippings down the drain, this meal vanished practically overnight. And honestly, that might be one of the great quiet tragedies of 20th century cooking. 2. Milk toast. Milk toast has such an unfortunate reputation. Somewhere along the way, it became a phrase meaning something bland and spineless, which is deeply unfair to both the toast and the people who ate it. For families during the Depression era and both world wars, milk toast, Micus Lex, was comfort in its purest form. You'd toast your bread until it was golden, then break it into pieces in a bowl. Warm, sweetened milk went over the top. Sometimes a little butter, sometimes a pinch of cinnamon if you were feeling extravagant. The toast would soften in the milk, soaking it up slowly, creating something that sat somewhere between soup and cereal and dessert all at once.
Mothers made this for sick children. Grandmothers made it for elderly family members who had trouble chewing tougher food. But honestly, perfectly healthy adults ate this for dinner during lean weeks, and not one of them considered it a hardship.
There's something almost meditative about a bowl of warm milk toast on a cold evening. It asks nothing of you. It just quietly nourishes. We replaced it with elaborate cereal brands and expensive comfort food recipes that take an hour to prepare. I'm not sure we came out ahead on that trade. 3. Fried bologna with mustard gravy. Now here is where things get interesting, and if you grew up in a working class household in the Midwest or the South, you might already be nodding your head. Fried bologna on its own is still beloved in certain circles, and rightly so. But fried bologna with mustard gravy? That was a whole separate level of ingenuity. You'd slice your bologna thick, score the edges so it wouldn't curl too dramatically in the pan, and fry it in a cast iron skillet until the edges got dark and crispy and the whole kitchen smelled incredible. Then, and this is the part that separates the recipe from pure genius, you'd build a quick pan gravy right there in the same skillet. A little flour stirred into the drippings, milk slowly added, and a generous spoonful of yellow mustard whisked in while everything thickened up. That mustard gravy had a sharp, tangy warmth that cut right through the richness of the fried meat. You'd ladle the whole thing over white bread or biscuits and sit down to something that genuinely felt like a proper meal, even if the entire thing cost less than 30 cents.
Fried bologna with mustard gravy was popular from roughly the 1930s clear through the 1960s in rural communities. The second families could afford actual pork chops or chicken. This dish got quietly retired. Their loss, if you ask me.
4. Bean soup with cornbread crumbles. I need you to understand something about dried beans before we go any further. They were not a side dish or a garnish. For millions of American families across multiple generations, dried beans were the main event, the whole show, the entire reason dinner happened. Pinto beans, navy beans, great northern beans, simmered low and slow for hours, with whatever scraps of ham hock or salt pork were available. You'd start them in the morning and let them go all day, the broth thickening and darkening into something creamy and deeply savory. Then you made cornbread, crumbled it directly into your bowl, and watched it absorb that smoky bean broth into soft, flavorful pockets that balanced everything perfectly. Appalachian families, southern farming communities, Midwest working households, they all had their version. It sustained generations. When prosperity arrived and meat became affordable every night, the bean soup pot got moved to the back of the stove. Some families never took it back out again. 5. Hamburger, gravy over white bread. We talked about hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes in other conversations about Depression-era cooking, and that version is wonderful. But there was an even more stripped-down variation that deserves its own recognition. Hamburger, gravy over plain white bread.
When there were no potatoes in the house, and no rice, and no biscuits ready to bake, you used what you had: a pound of ground beef, browned and broken up in a skillet, then a simple roux built right in that same pan with flour and milk, a generous amount of black pepper, maybe an onion if one was available, and a thick, peppery meat gravy poured directly over slices of plain white bread laid flat on the plate.
The bread soaked up that gravy from the bottom, while the top stayed slightly absorbent, creating two completely different textures in the same bite. Kids didn't complain. Adults didn't apologize. This was dinner, and it was filling and honest and required almost nothing from the pantry. You see this dish appearing in family memoirs and Depression-era cookbooks from roughly 1930 through the mid-1950s. When grocery budgets expanded in post-war America, this version of hamburger gravy got left behind in favor of the fancier mashed potato presentation. But frankly, the white bread version has a humble charm that the other can't quite match. 6. Crackers and milk. I'm going to pause here because some of you are already saying, Betty, that's not a meal, that's a snack. And to that I say, you are correct, and also you are missing the entire point. Crackers and milk was absolutely a meal for children during lean times. A bowl, a handful of saltines, cold milk poured over the top. You'd eat them while still crisp, or wait and let them soften into something almost porridge-like, depending on your preference. In rural households during the 1930s and 40s, this was standard supper for young children when the adult food only stretched so far.
Mothers fed the children first, making sure small bellies were full before serving whatever was on the stove to the grown-ups. There was no embarrassment attached to it then. It was simply what small people ate when resources were tight.
There's something quietly moving about a bowl of crackers and cold milk, representing a mother's best effort on a hard evening, don't you think? 7. Potato soup with bacon. Grease. Potato soup still exists in modern kitchens, but I want to be very clear that what gets called potato soup today, loaded with cream and cheese and sour cream and approximately 14 toppings, bears almost no resemblance to the version that sustained working families for the better part of a century. Old-fashioned potato soup was water, potatoes, onion, salt, pepper, and bacon grease. That was the whole ingredient list. You diced your potatoes and onions, covered them with water, added a generous spoonful of bacon drippings from that ever-present crock beside the stove, and simmered everything until the potatoes were completely soft. Some cooks would mash some of the potatoes against the side of the pot to thicken the broth naturally, without adding any flour or cream. The bacon grease gave the whole thing a smoky, savory depth that made the simple potato broth taste considerably richer than it had any right to. Served with more cornbread or a heel of white bread for soaking, this soup could fill up a table full of hungry people for almost nothing. Families in Appalachia, the rural South, and the Plains. States relied on this soup heavily during the winters of the 1930s through 1950s. When fresh cream and butter became consistently affordable, the bacon grease version faded out so quickly it's almost like it was never there. 8. Fried salt pork with brown gravy.
Before bacon became the celebrity protein of the 21st century, before anybody had heard of artisan charcuterie, there was salt pork. And if you don't know what salt pork is, it's essentially a slab of cured pork fat with some meat running through it, preserved entirely in salt. It was cheap. It lasted forever without refrigeration in cooler months, and it could transform an otherwise flavorless meal into something worth eating.
You'd slice the salt pork thin, rinse it to remove some of the surface salt, and fry it in a dry skillet until it rendered its fat and turned golden brown. Then you'd build a brown gravy in that rendered fat, using flour and water or milk, scraping up all the brown bits from the pan bottom to create a gravy with genuine depth and a beautiful dark color. That gravy got poured over biscuits, boiled potatoes, white rice, or whatever starchy base was available. The salt pork itself sat on top, crispy and rich and intensely savory in a way that a small amount of could make an entire plate taste like a proper dinner. This was a staple meal in the rural South from the 1800s, right through the middle of the 20th century. When refrigeration improved and fresh pork became reliably affordable, salt pork lost its role as a primary protein and got quietly reassigned to the position of seasoning ingredient in bean pots and greens. The full salt pork supper with brown gravy basically vanished completely. 9. Egg gravy on biscuits.
Biscuits and gravy is still alive and well in American diners, and thank goodness for that. But the version most people know today, made with sausage crumbles and thick cream gravy, is the prosperous cousin of a much simpler dish: egg gravy on biscuits.
When there was no sausage in the house, and some weeks there genuinely wasn't, you made gravy from eggs instead. You'd fry a couple of eggs in a skillet with a spoonful of bacon grease. Then rather than removing them and serving them separately, you'd break the yolks and stir in flour and milk directly in the pan, scrambling the eggs into the gravy as it formed. The eggs thickened the gravy naturally while adding protein and a rich yellow color. Poured over split, freshly baked biscuits, this was a breakfast that could easily become a dinner when times called for it. The flavor was gentler than sausage gravy, softer, slightly eggy, with that unmistakable richness that comes from cooking in that cast iron with bacon fat. Rural families across the Midwest and South made egg gravy throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Children grew up on it without ever thinking it was a lesser version of anything. It was simply gravy. When sausage became a daily affordable item in the 1960s, egg gravy stepped aside without anyone really noticing it had gone. 10. Tomato gravy over rice. Now I realize we've talked about several gravies already, and you might be wondering, Betty, how many gravies are on this list? The answer is enough. Gravy was how Depression-era cooks made something from almost nothing, and each variation tells a different story about regional ingenuity. Tomato gravy is a Southern and Appalachian tradition going back generations. Bacon drippings in a hot skillet. Flour stirred in to make a roux, then canned or fresh diced tomatoes added with a little water. The tomatoes broke down into the flour and fat, creating a tangy, slightly sweet, deeply savory gravy completely unlike anything made with milk or meat drippings.
Poured over plain white rice or biscuits, this was a complete meal for families who had a can of tomatoes and precious little else. As cream-based gravies became the standard and fresh vegetables became affordable year-round, tomato gravy quietly disappeared from family tables, surviving only in the memories of those who grew up eating it by necessity.
11. Cornmeal mush with sorghum. Here is a meal that will get you some very strange looks at a dinner party in the 21st century, but kept entire farming communities fed through some of the hardest decades in American history. Cornmeal mush is simply cornmeal cooked slowly in water until thick and porridge-like. It's the predecessor of polenta, though nobody called it that until polenta became fashionable in the 1990s. Funny how that works. You'd stir the cornmeal into boiling salted water slowly until it thickened into a smooth, dense mass. Topped with a pour of sorghum molasses, it was sweet, filling, warming, and cost almost nothing. Now, sorghum deserves a moment of recognition here because it has been deeply underappreciated. Dark, thick, slightly bittersweet, earthy and rich with a faint smoky undertone. It was the sweetener of choice for rural families who couldn't afford refined sugar. When sugar became cheap and cornmeal mush got reclassified as farm animal feed, it left the dinner table almost entirely. Its loss is genuinely our loss. 12. Pinto beans and fatback. If bread and drippings was the meal of the absolute bottom of the pantry, pinto beans and fatback was managed poverty done with genuine skill and dignity. It required almost nothing in ingredients, but it required time, patience, and knowledge of how to coax flavor out of humble materials. Dried pinto beans soaked overnight, then cooked low and slow the next morning with a chunk of fatback buried in the pot. Fatback is the cured fat layer from the back of a pig, even fattier than salt pork, and it gave the bean pot a richness that made the broth taste like it had been cooking for days. By supper time, creamy, tender beans swimming in smoky, savory broth. Cornbread on the side for dipping. That was the entire meal. No side salad, no vegetable medley, just beans, broth, pork fat, and cornbread.
And yet families sat down to this and felt genuinely satisfied in a way that a lot of elaborate modern dinners simply fail to deliver. Ask anyone over 70 who grew up eating this and watch their face. That tells you everything.
13. Cold plate supper. Not every forgotten meal involved cooking, and the cold plate supper is proof of that. This was the meal that happened on Sunday evenings, on hot summer nights, or on days when the wood stove wasn't lit and nobody had the energy to light it. You took everything left over from the week, sliced it thin, arranged it on plates, and called it supper. Cold, sliced meatloaf from Tuesday, the last of the pinto beans straight from the pot. A few slices of whatever bread remained. Pickles, maybe a deviled egg or two if the hens had been laying. Nothing was heated. Nothing was elaborated on. Each person got a plate of cold bits and pieces, and the meal was eaten quietly and without complaint, because cold food was still food, and food was never something to complain about. The second microwave ovens made reheating effortless. The cold plate supper retired itself, but its underlying philosophy, use everything, waste nothing, was wisdom worth keeping, and honestly, worth revisiting. 14. Savory bread pudding. Most people know bread pudding as a dessert today, sweet, eggy, soaked in vanilla custard with whiskey sauce on top. And that version is wonderful. But before bread pudding became a restaurant staple, it existed in a completely different form in working class kitchens across America. Savory bread pudding was what happened when you had stale bread, too far gone for sandwiches, and not enough other food to make a proper meal. You'd tear the bread into pieces, soak it in eggs beaten with milk or water, then add whatever savory ingredients were available, diced onion, a scraping of bacon drippings, a pinch of sage, maybe some crumbled salt pork,
into a greased baking dish until it puffed up, set firm, and turned golden on top, somewhere between a casserole and a stuffing, dense, savory, and deeply satisfying. When supermarkets began offering affordable sliced bread in endless quantities, the idea of stretching old bread into a savory main dish faded from necessity.
And with the necessity went the recipe. 15. Oatmeal for dinner. I'll be honest with you. This is the one on the list that probably requires the most reframing for a modern audience. Oatmeal for dinner. Not as a trendy grain bowl with poached eggs and avocado on top. Just oatmeal. Plain, cooked in water, salted, maybe with a spoonful of bacon grease stirred in for flavor. Served in a bowl for the evening meal. During the hardest stretches of the Depression, particularly in rural farming communities in the 1930s, dinner was sometimes whatever was available, and what was available was sometimes just oats. A 50-pound sack of rolled oats was one of the cheapest grocery purchases possible and could feed a family for weeks. Oatmeal for dinner was not presented as deprivation. It was presented as supper, same as anything else. Children ate it without drama because their parents ate it without drama. And that kind of quiet dignity around a humble meal was its own form of teaching. We forgot this meal not because it was bad, but because abundance made it unnecessary, which, when you think about it, is exactly the point of this entire video. 16. Depression soup. Depression soup doesn't have one official recipe. That's actually the whole point of it. It was the meal that got made when the refrigerator and the pantry between them yielded almost nothing individually, but together yielded just enough. A cup of dried beans, not quite enough for a full pot. The last 2 potatoes in the bin, a heel of cabbage, 1 onion, the end of a smoked ham hock that had already flavored 2 previous pots, water, salt, thyme. Everything into one pot until it became a thick, murky, deeply flavored soup impossible to reproduce exactly because it was never made the same way twice. The recipe was whatever you had. The technique was patience. Depression soup taught generations a fundamental truth we've mostly forgotten. Flavor doesn't come from quality alone. It comes from time, heat, and many humble things cooked together long enough to become something greater than the sum of their parts. When prosperity made it unnecessary, nobody made it anymore. But in terms of pure cooking wisdom, this soup contained more knowledge than most modern recipes ever will. 17. Fried potato and onion skillet. Now here is a meal that requires almost no introduction because enough people grew up eating it that its legend has survived, though its role as a primary dinner has mostly faded. Fried potatoes and onions in a cast iron skillet. The smell alone could bring a family to the table from the farthest corner of the property.
You'd slice your potatoes thin, not too thin, or they'd fall apart, and your onions into rings, then get a generous amount of bacon grease, or lard, good and hot in a heavy skillet. In went the potatoes first, spread in an even layer, left alone long enough to develop a golden crust on the bottom before being flipped and disturbed. The onions went in partway through, their sugars caramelizing against the hot fat and turning sweet and almost jammy by the time the potatoes were cooked through.
Salt, black pepper, and nothing else. That was the seasoning. The cast iron did the rest. This skillet got served as the main dish for supper on countless evenings throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, when meat wasn't available and potatoes and onions from the root cellar were what you had. Eaten with more bread on the side, it was a real meal, filling, flavorful, and made with real skill, even if it looked simple. Today, fried potatoes and onions are a side dish or a breakfast component. They've been demoted, but for a generation of American families, this skillet was the whole point of dinner, and nobody sat down to it feeling sorry for themselves. 18. Creamed chipped beef on toast. I have to say this one's name out loud with full respect because it earned its reputation the hard way. Creamed chipped beef on toast was served to United States military personnel for so many decades that it earned a nickname I cannot repeat on this channel. But if you know, you know. And yet, outside the military, this dish was a genuine working-class staple that deserves far better than its current reputation. Chipped beef, which is thinly shaved, dried, and salted beef, sold in small glass jars, was one of the most affordable protein sources available from the 1920s through the 1960s. You'd rinse the beef briefly to reduce some of its intense saltiness, then add it to a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. The sauce thickened around the shredded beef, absorbing its smoky, salty flavor into every spoonful. Poured over 2 slices of plain white toast. This was a meal that provided real protein, real satisfaction, and cost almost nothing to produce. Families who couldn't afford fresh meat at every meal kept jars of chipped beef in the pantry the way we keep canned tuna today. The dish was particularly popular during World War II rationing and through the Korean War era. As fresh deli meats became affordable and convenient, the little glass jars of chipped beef slowly disappeared from supermarket shelves and from family tables with them. Finding chipped beef in a grocery store today takes genuine effort, which tells you everything about how thoroughly this meal has been left behind. 19. Stewed tomatoes over crackers. There is a quiet dignity to stewed tomatoes over crackers that I don't think gets nearly enough recognition. This was the meal that showed up when the garden had been generous with tomatoes, when summer canning had produced more jars than expected, and when the question of what to make for supper needed answering quickly and cheaply. You'd open a jar of home-canned tomatoes or use fresh ones from the garden in summer. Put them in a saucepan with a little butter, salt, pepper, and a small pinch of sugar to balance the acidity. Cook them down slowly until they softened and concentrated into a thick, deeply flavored stew that smelled like the end of summer in the best possible way. That stew got ladled over a bed of salty nut crackers, spread across a shallow bowl. The crackers absorbed the warm tomato liquid and softened into the stew, creating something that was simultaneously breathy and starchy and completely satisfying in a way that felt more substantial than the ingredients suggested it should. Southern and Midwestern families made this meal from the late 1800s through the mid-20th century, particularly in the summer and fall canning seasons. As refrigeration improved and tomato soup from a can became a kitchen staple, stewed tomatoes over crackers lost its practical purpose and faded quietly into the past. 20. Peanut butter and lard sandwich. The one that requires the least explanation and the most humility to appreciate properly: the peanut butter and lard sandwich. Now I want to be careful here because I know some of you just made a face, and I understand that reaction. But I need you to set aside everything your 21st century brain knows about dietary fat and just be present in a 1930s farmhouse kitchen for a moment. Peanut butter was affordable protein, lard was rendered animal fat that cost almost nothing, and provided the calories that physical laborers and their families genuinely needed to function through long days of hard work. Spread together on white bread, this sandwich delivered energy in a form that the body could use immediately and sustain over hours. The lard added a richness that softened the density of the peanut butter and made the whole sandwich slide together in a way that was genuinely pleasant to eat, particularly if the lard was fresh rendered and still had a faint porky sweetness to it. Some families added a thin drizzle of sorghum or a scraping of fruit preserves when available, but the basic version was peanut butter, lard, bread, and nothing else. Rural farming families, coal mining communities, and factory workers carried these sandwiches in their lunch pails throughout the 1930s and 40s. They didn't eat them because they were unaware of better options. They ate them because these sandwiches got the job done and cost next to nothing at a time when next to nothing was the budget. When prosperity arrived and the idea of eating rendered animal fat on your sandwich became something to be embarrassed about rather than something to be grateful for, this sandwich disappeared almost immediately, and with it went a certain kind of unsentimental, practical relationship with food that this country hasn't quite recovered. 20 meals that kept American families alive, warm, and together through the Depression through wartime rationing, through poverty that most of us today can barely imagine, and through decades of making something from almost nothing with skill and grace and zero self-pity. These dishes didn't disappear because someone decided they were bad. They disappeared because America got wealthy enough to forget why they existed in the first place. And I think there's something worth pausing on in that, because every single one of these meals represents a kind of cooking wisdom. Patience, resourcefulness, respect for ingredients, and the understanding that a meal doesn't have to be expensive or elaborate to be worth making with care. My grandmother made half of these meals. My mother made several of them. And I've made a few myself on tight months when the grocery budget ran out before the calendar did. And I was grateful to know how. I'm Grandma Betty, and this has been Grandma Betty's Recipes. If this video meant something to you, if it reminded you of a kitchen you grew up in or a meal you haven't thought about in 50 years, I want to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me what your family ate when times were hard. Those stories matter. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. There are more forgotten kitchens and lost recipes to explore, and I promise I'll be here every week ready to take you back to them. See you next time, honey.